I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Inez Stepman.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Today, Inez is going to help us cover the right's major opportunity that they have to crush universities amid their rising anti-Semitism. Ben is going to walk us through the latest developments in Trump's January 6th case, as well as the latest indictment against Hunter Biden. Will is going to explain why Nikki Haley is getting all of these new endorsements, apparently, including one coming from the New Hampshire governor. And I will talk about a Satanist display that has been put up in the Iowa state capitol. So with that, let's go ahead and kick it off with Inez.
Yeah, so I think we were all very pessimistic people week after week. Here we are telling you about all the Rubicons that have been crossed and our beloved republic is no more. So for once, I actually want to do an optimistic segment. I think this is a huge opportunity for the right to seriously damage one of the institutions that is most responsible for the left's power in this country and most responsible for the direction of our country and our politics and all the problems that we face. And that is, of course, American universities, in particular, the Ivy League. So just to lay out for those of you who have been under a rock for the last week and a half, there was some explosive testimony of the heads of several universities, including Harvard and University of Pennsylvania, in front of Congress, where they basically downplayed. They said that context was required to know whether calls for genocide of Jews on their campuses violate their speech policies or their student policies. Now, just as a first point, anyone who takes a free speech defense from American universities at this point is just being a useful idiot. It is obviously, they obviously don't believe in free speech. They've demonstrated that over and over and over again. And at UPenn itself, of course, they are ongoing in their attempts to remove Amy Wax for her speech at that university. This is obviously just a ploy that they thought that essentially the right would buy, that we would go the libertarian route and we would say, yes, like this is speech. We have to tolerate even ugly speech, even though our speech is not tolerated on university campuses. So in terms of just continuing facts, there's been calls for resignations of these three presidents. The president of UPenn has resigned. The president of Harvard, Claudine Gay, the board met last night, decided we're recording this on Tuesday, not to fire her, not to force her to offer her resignation. She's sticking. I actually think, and then there's one more element, I think, before I get to the analysis. University of Wisconsin and the state legislature there are locked in a battle over $800 million of funding to those public universities in the state because there was a request for a freeze on DEI departments and hiring. The university voted down $800 million in order to preserve their DEI department. I actually think these outcomes are good for us. I think it is good that President Gay is retained at Harvard. I think it is easier. I prefer clarity as to where universities are. And I think this is an enormous opportunity for the right. And I'll lay out why, because I've seen a lot of pessimism, and usually I'm on the pessimistic side of things. Not this time. I've seen the arguments around that, like, oh, this is just going to result in a carve out for Jews in the DEI structure, right? That's going to be the sort of settlement that's reached between the different parts of the left on campus. I think people are really downplaying how impossible that is for the left internally. They've empowered a mob, and the mob has taken a position just like they did in 2020 when that sort of bat signal goes out to the radical left and the revolutionaries there. It's very, very difficult for even like democratic establishmentarians, and as we've seen over and over again, definitely for university presidents, for sort of Gen X or boomer holdovers to try to rein in the revolutionaries that they've created. I think we're downplaying how difficult that carve out will be, and the inability of the left to settle this within its own coalition. Second, I think the fight about the $800 million is instructive. We have created the position through policy decisions that can be changed with political will. We have created the position that higher education in America finds itself in, right? They are heavily, heavily funded by taxpayer money, both on the federal and state level. They are dependent on federally backed student loans. They are dependent on federal grants to operate. And they are dependent on us looking the other way while they amass in Harvard's case, $53 billion endowments that would put it in the top 10 hedge funds in the United States, tax-free. They are dependent on all of those policy choices for the wealth and prestige that they've been able to gather. And I'd add another policy choice, right? And that is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, in particular, the 90s revisions and the interpretations of that law that have basically made it impossible for employers to test for skills or competency through any other means than a university degree. For some reason, there's a carve out at the EEOC, that the body that is responsible for looking at disparate impact. Of course, every single policy decision, everything in the world. Gail Harriet has a great article called "Everything Has a Disparate Impact." So literally the EEOC board could choose to look at any factor whatsoever and probably discover a racial impact, disparate impact within that factor. They have chosen specifically not to look at the disparate impact of university degrees, which has been the reason that employers now have to basically, all they're testing for is a basic work ethic, being able to show up on time. In very few fields anymore is the college degree, any kind of mark of special skill or knowledge or even competency. It's just sort of that basic threshold level, but that has meant that universities have an extraordinary amount of power. They are the pipeline to the elite, and they've used that for political reasons. All of this is to say, these are policy choices. Republicans could always cut off this money. Republicans could always do something about taxing universities, especially in states where they have the legislature, but even on the federal level, they could always push for these policies. They have not, because of a lack of political will. And that is why I'm so optimistic about this moment. I think it is the moment where, where even though universities have given them ample reason for the last 30 and even 70 years to regard them as enemies, I think this might be the moment where the normie right and therefore the mainstream of the Republican Party starts to regard universities as what they are, which are hostile enemies in the United States. They're hostile to this country. They're hostile to the values not only of the right, but that the country is founded on, and they ought to be treated that way. But I'll throw it out to you guys. How am I wrong? Should I not be optimistic? Is this just going to be another carve out or a blip?
I don't think you're wrong to be optimistic. I think we managed to get a pretty big ally over to our side in guys like Bill Ackman, the CEO of Pershing Square, who's been doing effectively shareholder activism, but towards the board of trustees nowadays. And the one point I wanted to make about that is, Ackman is interesting. He's been writing some letters and pointing out now, in particular, how they're not just discriminating against Jews, they're discriminating against straight white males as well as Asian males and others, and that he didn't really think hard about that until this big kerfluffle over anti-Semitism. And some people are going after him saying, well, oh, you're a late coming ally, or, oh, you should have realized that earlier. But I hope everybody recognizes that you want your allies to join you. You shouldn't get mad at people for not realizing, if they've come around to your way of thinking, you shouldn't get mad at them for not having come around to your way of thinking earlier. And just in general, I'm enjoying his Twitter feed a lot.
I'm currently working on a story. Actually, it might be out by the time this podcast comes out, but there are some students at Boston University who are so disturbed by what's happening on their campus. They're Jewish or Israeli students, that they've spent the past couple of weeks basically compiling as much material as possible and trying to get it to the news media because they feel completely abandoned by their administration. And they have videos of people tearing down the hostage posters. They have video of the pro-Palestinian students actually memorializing confirmed Hamas terrorists during a sit-in. Really disturbing stuff. And I think this level of intensity that's come with the anti-Semitism being spread on campuses is at a level that I've never seen before, and I've been covering campuses since 2015, really, and even when I was still in school. So I think you're right, Inez. This moment is really ripe for opportunity, and I hope that conservatives take advantage of it.
I've long argued that Jew hatred is the glue that holds the intersectional left and Islamic supremacist alliance together. And I think in the wake of the October 7th attacks, that has shown itself for all the world to see, but it's also exposed how cowed and fundamentally corrupted our institutions are, including our elite schools. And I think it's worth noting that, yes, these three school presidents were put forth in testimony for all to see. But if you looked at the presidents of the top 300 schools in the country, let's say, you would probably get similarly morally bankrupt, feckless, cowardly answers. And this is the natural end of the DEI agenda. It's personified in some ways, it appears, by some of these leaders themselves. We didn't even get to talk really about the plagiarism allegations against Claudine Gay, which Harvard's leaders have essentially just dismissed and ignored in choosing to stand behind her. But the fraud there in a person who does not appear to have been qualified for that position, at least on the stated qualifications for a university president, speak to the fraud that's been foisted on the public of these elite schools themselves, which have completely de-emphasized merit, excellence, achievement, devotion to the very Western principles that undergird our academy and built our academy into, the shining light for the world, essentially, as to what academic institutions ought to look like. This has basically proven the fraud that has been foisted on us, that not only the intellectual rot and also the moral bankruptcy at these institutions. Should we look at this as a positive that has been exposed? Absolutely. The fact that simple, clear, focused questioning could expose so much points to the question of where have other Republican representatives been for years on these issues? But that said, rather than castigate those who's taken a while to come along, I think to Will's point, look, politics is a game, it's a competition of addition. We should welcome those who are coming over to our side. We should repeatedly emphasize the point that this is more broadly about the natural end of a DEI agenda on campus, which protects tyrants essentially and subjects everyone else who would stand in their way to unreachable standards. Obviously, the point should always be emphasized. Genocide against Jews is apparently okay to argue on campus, and only after the genocide occurs, apparently, does it become a violation of the code. But microaggressions or hanging offenses or misgendering someone will get you thrown off campus. We should emphasize that, but it should be widespread condemnation, left and right, about the natural end of the DEI agenda. And to the extent that's where the focus goes from wealthy and influential folks like a Bill Ackman, that's great. And we ought to be cheering that on and helping to accelerate that process. And I think folks like Chris Rufo have done a really good job in framing it as such.
I think it's important to point out, too, that one of the people Claudia Gay was accused of plagiarizing was Carol Swain, of all people, who has sort of been cast out and rejected by the academic elite because she does the wrong type of scholarship. So it's a nice twist of irony in this whole saga. We're going to kick it right back to Ben for your analysis of the recent legal challenges against Donald Trump and Hunter Biden.
Yeah, so on an entirely different note, there have been a whole slew of developments really in the last week regarding both the Donald Trump January 6th case and associated cases that have implications for that case, as well as in the ongoing Hunter Biden, which is really Joe Biden saga. So I want to tick off some of these developments, and then we can kind of talk about what the ramifications of them are, what they mean for rule of law, what they mean for 2024 and beyond. So first, maybe the least significant, but there were many headlines about it, is that on December 8th, so that's last week, an appeals court narrowed the gag order on Donald Trump that had been imposed upon him by Judge Chutkan, who's overseeing Jack Smith's January 6th case. She said the appeals court panel ruled that the gag order, quote, sweeps too broadly, but it still upheld major components of it. So call it a qualified victory. which the Trump legal team does not consider a victory. They've already indicated that they are going to appeal the continuation of that gag order, presumably up to the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court is also grappling with a couple of other issues. One of them, which is very related to Trump's case, is this use of obstruction of an official proceeding as a charge, which more than 300 January 6ers were hit with. This is a felony offense, which comes, as we've talked about before, from Sarbanes-Oxley, and it's supposed to deal with witness tampering, for material fraud dealing with property, for example, when it comes to obstructing an official proceeding. That has been hung around the necks of January 6ers for the first time ever applied, in the words of the judges who have ruled on these cases and appeals judges who are looking at these cases, to essentially say that if you protest during an official hearing, that can be obstruction of an official proceeding, which there's really no basis in the plain language of the statutes, let alone the debate around it. Again, going back to Sarbox and Enron fraud. Set that aside, though. Several defendants in those cases have sought to appeal to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is considering whether or not they're going to review a splintered set of appeals court ruling on these cases. So it's not really clear, essentially, whether or not obstruction of an official proceeding can be applied to J6ers. Trump has been hit with 2 obstruction of an official proceeding charges. One is the actual obstruction. Another is conspiracy to obstruct. That's 2 of the 4 charges that Jack Smith has brought against him. Supreme Court was likely going to rule on whether they would grant cert and hear these appeals on obstruction of an official proceeding and actually provide some clarity on the law, letter and spirit. They did not rule on that in their most recent set of orders. So apparently it is being relisted, and legal observers are expecting some kind of resolution to this in January. So there's some limbo there with respect to those charges, which have direct bearing on Trump's case. By the same token, the Supreme Court did rule in Jack Smith's favor when he brought essentially an emergency petition for cert regarding Trump's argument, his legal team's argument, that the charges brought against him in the J6 case ought to be null and void, dismissed, because he has presidential immunity. These are charges stemming from conduct while he was president. And then there would be double jeopardy in bringing certain charges because he was acquitted by the Senate on the same charges. This went to an appeals court. Judge Chutkan had dismissed this, predictably, went to an appeals court. While it's pending in an appeals court, Jack Smith said, let's skip that step and let's take this right to the SCOTUS. And SCOTUS quickly responded that Trump's team ought to respond to Jack Smith's request for the Supreme Court to quickly move on this. And the whole rationale here from Smith's perspective is this was likely going to end up at the Supreme Court, but also we need to accelerate this as fast as possible because somehow it's in the public's interest to get a really quick response so that the trial can stay on target for a March 4th trial date and ultimately potentially a conviction in the middle of the 2024 election. It seems that the court has at least bought the idea that there's merit to Jack Smith bringing this petition for cert, and so Trump's team has to respond to it quite swiftly. So there's a question now of, is this the court truly on the merits wanting to resolve this, or is the court essentially going to fold to the pressure that I've long argued is going to be thrust upon it in response to all of these cases, because many aspects of the Trump cases are likely to land at the Supreme Court ultimately. I've long argued that the whole plan is to have a maximum pressure campaign from the left, the regime, against the court so that it will cave when and if many elements of these cases end up there. This is the first test of that idea. And so far, I would say that the court has not necessarily passed that test. So this should give us real pause, even though they have not ruled on the merits of the petition for cert that Jack Smith is looking for. Okay, so those are the Trump cases. We could talk about the fraud trial in New York as well, but I'll set that aside for this week. Also last week on December 8th, Hunter Biden was finally hit with tax charges in California. Special counsel David Weiss had said that there were likely going to be tax charges coming after the collapsed sham global immunity get out of jail free card deal fell in Delaware court. Gun charges have been brought in Delaware. Now tax charges have been brought in California. What do these tax charges entail? They entail tax evasion, filing false returns, failures to file and pay. There are 3 felonies and 6 misdemeanor offenses, so 9 total offenses. Hunter Biden can face 17 years in prison if convicted on these offenses. The big takeaway in this case, from my perspective, is yes, finally, David Weiss brought the tax charges they had claimed, but the tax charges are still part of the cover-up, not least of which because those tax charges have nothing to do with the most serious likely offenses pertaining to the Burisma and other work, the statutes of limitation of which have lapsed thanks to the efforts of David Weiss presiding over the Hunter Biden case, but also because it's not the tax evasion, yes, a crime that's really at issue, but it's the money that the taxes were evaded on. Where did it come from? What crimes were committed in connection therewith? To what extent did it compromise our national security? And to that end, of course, there's no unregistered Foreign Agent Registration Act charges here. There's no money laundering charges here. There's nothing around the sex trafficking charges that apparently should have been brought in connection with these ill-gotten gains. So this is basically tax charges around evasion and the fact that there were fraudulent business expenses deducted, business expenses that in reality were hundreds of thousands of dollars towards prostitutes and adult entertainment, according to the 4 letters of the document. Those are lurid details. That's where the focus is going to be on this. But the real focus ought to be on this is still part of a continued cover-up. There's nothing about the Biden international influence peddling scheme here. It's still tangential. Now, all that said, interestingly enough, yesterday, which is the 11th before we're recording today, Hunter Biden's team in Delaware brought a slew of motions for dismissal of that case. And these are kind of laughable, but at the same time, it's going to be fascinating to see how the DOJ grapples with these motions. So one is selective and vindictive prosecution. The arguments being put forth and has been put forth through media leaks as well, that somehow Republicans have weaponized the Department of Justice, and that's why the Department of Justice brought these charges against Hunter Biden. So that's one aspect. Another is that David Weiss, and of course, this is sort of a troll to conservatives here, but we'll let it sit on its merits for a moment, that David Weiss was not authorized to bring any of these charges because he was tabbed as a special counsel in violation of DOJ regulations. He was coming from inside government. These issues were raised by Republicans after special counsel Weiss was tabbed as special counsel when he wasn't supposed to need those authorities. So, and also in connection with this dismissal motion, that monies have not been properly appropriated for his work. Last but 2 more issues here. They say that the pretrial diversion agreement, that get out of jail global immunity agreement, is still in place, even though the DOJ has argued otherwise. So thus all the charges are null and void. And also in that filing for dismissal, they say that this has implications for the California case as well. So Hunter Biden's legal team is making the case that the pretrial diversion agreement is still in place. You can't bring these charges. And this would kill both the Delaware gun case and the California tax case. Last but not least, and another troll to Republicans here, and they kind of teed this up in advance. They're saying that the Hunter Biden gun charges, which are around obtaining a firearm while he was using unlawful substances, that he was an unlawful user of those substances, that under the Bruin ruling and a conservative reading of the Second Amendment, these charges are unconstitutional, essentially, and it should be null and void. Last but not least, we have an impeachment inquiry formalization vote that's supposed to come tomorrow. We're recording this today, again, Tuesday the 12th, tomorrow the 13th. Hunter Biden was also supposed to sit for a transcribed interview, a deposition tomorrow. We'll see what happens with that. Investigators have said they'll hold him in contempt if he doesn't show. So there's a whole mess of lawfare going here. It has obviously huge bearings on the impeachment inquiry into Joe Biden in 2024, and of course, what transpires with Donald Trump in 2024. I guess, a couple questions that I would continue to put forth are, do we think that the Supreme Court is going to fold when it comes to these cases that ultimately come before it? And then another is, to what extent does this maybe heighten the scrutiny of the DOJ? The DOJ is put between a rock and a hard place, and I wonder how you guys think they're going to work their way out of it when Hunter Biden's team is going to say that the DOJ is going too hard on Hunter Biden, and DOJ was going to have to argue that actually they went too easy on Hunter Biden, potentially. So how do they work themselves out of those knots, and what does this all mean for Trump and the lawfare that he's facing in 2024? A couple questions maybe worth parsing.
I'll keep my comments brief, just to the point that it is very interesting that this indictment in California of Hunter Biden's tax evasion really only focuses on the flow of money in a certain direction, meaning it focuses on the flow of money out of Hunter Biden's bank accounts regarding what he actually spent his money on while he was evading taxes, and focuses far less on the source of the money and how he was gathering all of this from foreign business interests and the potential that that could have led to a connection with the then Vice President Joe Biden. So I think you're right on the money there, Ben, that this indictment is very much lacking in terms of the real there that Republicans are investigating in regards to the Biden family corruption.
Again, just a couple brief points since we're out of time. One, they obviously want Hunter to be the fall guy for this, and Hunter doesn't want to be the fall guy for this, which is, I think, just the background of all of this. As you say, Amber, the lack of focus on where the money came from. They want him essentially to take the fall of how he spent it. That's apparently not something Hunter is willing to do. So that will continue to cause us amusement, I think, going forward. On the first topic that Ben brought up about Trump's trial and about this appeal to the Supreme Court, all of these things could be resolved, including, for example, the tension between the First Amendment and the gag order that courts are putting on Trump. If we were willing to delay, if courts were willing to delay, and if the prosecution was willing to delay the trial until after the election, that's the easiest and cleanest way to resolve those legal conflicts. Because it's true, like usually in a trial, you don't get to go out and lambast the judge without consequence, right? Like you don't get to, there are consequences in the four corners of a courtroom that don't apply in the broader context of American life. But that's exactly why it's so ridiculous to charge someone who is likely going to be the nominee of one of the major parties, right? That's exactly what, and I think it does demonstrate for those who had any doubts about it, although I don't think there are that many people listening to this podcast who ever had any, that this is political, because the cleanest solution would be to move the trial to after the election. But they don't want to do that because that sacrifices certain political advantages, including muzzling Donald Trump while he's running for president.
Yeah. So to answer your question, Ben, I don't actually think the Supreme Court will fold. I think if the Supreme Court is given an opportunity, there are enough conservatives on it that are going to say, you're not going to, Mr. Smith, you're not getting any special treatment. We're going to consider things in order. And yeah, if that means you don't get a trial in 80 days, sorry, but guess what? There's actually some complicated issues that we're going to need to resolve. And that's like the first white pill I've had on this stuff in a while, because I've been very, very black-pilled on the probability of the DC case being resolved very quickly, because everybody else, except perhaps the Supreme Court, is being guided by the political motivation of getting that trial happening in the spring at the perfect time for the Democrats, after the, essentially most of the primary elections are over, but before the general. They want a world in which Donald Trump is not able to campaign, where he's, effectively a convicted felon and his movement is subject to the discretion of a judge, or maybe even remanded into custody. Like that's the world they're going for. And I don't know of anybody who had the power to stop it except the Supreme Court. And it required some bizarre criminal issue, because normally these criminal issues aren't even available to go up to the Supreme Court before a conviction. So I think that we're lucky. Anyway, transitioning to Miss Nikki Haley. So the news today is, it sounds like this evening, the governor of New Hampshire, Kristen Sununu, is going to endorse Nikki Haley for president in New Hampshire. It's obviously a big win for Nikki Haley to get an endorsement from one of the two early state governors. Obviously, Governor DeSantis got the Kim Reynolds endorsement a few weeks ago. That said, if you followed me on Twitter at all, I am not a fan of Nikki Haley. That I think Nikki Haley is actually the single worst candidate for office running. And I had a random liberal friend ask me, he's like, why? Well, it seems like Chris Christie is much more obnoxious, and anti-Trump and blah, blah, blah. Why do you like Nikki Haley worse? Or why do you dislike Nikki Haley? And I think the answer is because I know Chris Christie. I mean, the whole entire point of Christie's candidacy is just to be mean to Trump, and everybody sort of gets that. I don't really care. But Nikki Haley is doing the thing where she's pretending to be in step with the base, but is then offering her actual policy platform is just right in line with old school Bush style Republicanism and foreign policy, Wilsonianism, more democracies everywhere, the maximal interventionist nature. And then I think the second thing is, her instincts are those of an authoritarian liberal. The key to understanding Nikki Haley is that she was a politically ambitious person who wasn't a member of a party and who was in South Carolina. So if you're an ambitious person without serious ideological pre-commitments and you're in South Carolina, you're going to run as a Republican regardless of whether or not you're that conservative. It's kind of another way to understand Nancy Mace, for instance, who similarly is just very much, she's a Republican from South Carolina, but if you actually listen to her talk, the things she cares about are liberal issues, right? Like that's what she's invested in. And it's because of this phenomena of, essentially the red state liberal joining the GOP as a moderate, because spending your time, trying to make the South Carolina Democratic Party work or advance within that is a giant waste of everybody's energy. I mean, I knew somebody who was in the Idaho Democratic Party or worked for their activists, and I was like, talk about a waste of time and energy. You're never going to win anything. So that's the key to understanding Nikki Haley. And I mean, that flows through all her policies from, we're just going to admit as many immigrants as the corporations want, because they're the people who should be setting our immigration policy. And we're going to eliminate anonymous speech on the internet, because of course that's a great idea. And it's a national security threat that people are allowed to post anonymously. Again, the instincts of an authoritarian liberal person. And it's like she finds the absolute worst places to be libertarian. Like the only time she's ever going to be libertarian is, you guys want to regulate, prevent corporations from shutting you down. Well, we need to respect the free speech rights of the corporations. Like it's a sort of bizarre selective libertarianism that chooses places to be libertarian that any Democrat would love. So I don't know. I think Nikki Haley's totally out of step with the base. She's totally out of step with where the vast majority of the party is. I get that Sununu is endorsing her because he's a moderate squish himself, but I guess ultimately, I don't think Nikki Haley ever had a chance. And if these people truly were invested in, beating Donald Trump, the only candidate who has any meaningful path to do so, in my view, is DeSantis. But I don't know, maybe they're not really invested in it. Maybe they're more invested in the overall project of trying to return the establishment wing of the party to power. That I think ultimately explains their behavior best. And I think that as a result, like a DeSantis presidency might be the worst thing from their perspective, because, if DeSantis wins, that shows that the populist movement and the new and national conservatism itself, that is the new strain of the party for sure. It's more than just Trump. So that would be maybe the worst outcome for these people, which is why they're sort of, just going all in on Haley, who I don't see having any meaningful path to the nomination. But with that, I'll leave it, throw it open to you guys.
Yeah, I mean, Nikki Haley's instincts are, they show up in such moments of clarity over and over and over again that she has the exact wrong instincts, I think, for the moment. So I'll just give a few examples, right? Her comments on registering anonymous voices online, right? It betrays, I don't know if it betrays authoritarianism as much as she just doesn't understand. I really think she doesn't get any of the fault lines in politics. And she was surprised when there was pushback against that idea. She's continually surprised by the pushback because she really doesn't understand how bad an idea that is in the current political environment, by which I don't just mean where Republican voters are, but where power resides and the structure of the regime in America. She has no idea. She bends on culture war issues like transition for minors, even though that's exactly where you could appeal to moderates. Right. So these are not bending on culture war issues that only the right thinks are important. That's literally one of our best appeals to centrists and moderates, right, is about banning mutilation surgery on children. And yet she equivocates on that. She had those horrendous remarks on Fox about how this is a few months ago, but we'd love to welcome Disney to South Carolina, Disney and their jobs to South Carolina, right? Again, showing no understanding of the fault lines between the Republican Party and corporate America, just totally deaf to the structure of the landscape, right? To mix metaphors here. And then finally, in a completely grating way, she plays the sex and race card over and over and over again in this really obnoxious Republican version of identity politics, where every critique of her is because, Vivek Ramaswamy has a problem with women. And where every critique of her is the Democrats are attacking me because I'm a brown woman. it's incredibly grating. It's completely out of step with the core, and it of course suggests that she will not be an ally in the fight against DEI or the proliferations and regulations of the last, even let's say 30 years under the Civil Rights Act. She's totally out as an ally on those core issues. So again, I just think her instincts are completely out of step at the moment. I really do think her blip, though, her like sort of rise is really a wish casting event for the chattering classes and for the Republican establishment. I don't think she has any hope now. I'm not sure Ron DeSantis has any hope either against Trump. I think that may be our own wish casting, but for sure, I don't think that she has any serious chance of taking the nominee. The way the establishment, though, has lined up for Nikki Haley reminds me very much of Ted Cruz in 2015, right? Where ostensibly the establishment of the party was very, very much against Trump, but they thought they could work better with Trump than they would with sort of the more, I guess, the more like principled sort of far right candidate. I mean, there is not far right, but like at the time he was on the to the right of the Republican establishment, Ted Cruz. They sunk his candidacy and they kept booing Rubio because that was their preferred candidate. And then ultimately, when they had to choose between Trump and Cruz, they chose Trump. Just the dynamic of the race very much reminds me. We haven't learned much from 2015, but yeah, I'm not terribly worried about Nikki Haley. The only way in which she would gain power in the Republican Party is if Trump picks her as VP.
Yeah, I think you both nailed pretty well why I find Nikki Haley's entire candidacy to be offensive, frankly, especially on the way that she uses her womanhood as some kind of political weapon. The comments about how she wears heels not as a fashion statement, but for ammunition, which to this day nobody even understands what she's talking about. It's not even an analogy or metaphor that makes sense. In response to Vivek calling her Dick Cheney and 3-inch heels on the debate stage, she countered back that her heels are actually 5 inches tall, which maybe in like the 2008 or 2010 Republican Party, we would have all given her a yes queen. But these days, that's so out of fashion and so not in vogue and really cringy and annoying, frankly. So I every time I see her on the debate stage or elsewhere in her campaign, I find myself just being incredibly put off. But from a strategic standpoint on what this endorsement means from Governor Sununu, New Hampshire is a state that in the early primary process has far more independents than the other first 3, big states, including Iowa. And so I think Nikki Haley and Sununu are kind of betting on the fact that Haley will overperform there, and that would be a potential pickup for her because of the wide swath of independents. There's a Des Moines Register poll that came out this week that kind of speaks to this point, right? Where you see Haley is performing better in New Hampshire, DeSantis is performing better in Iowa, both, of course, about 30 points behind Trump. But even in New Hampshire, what's fascinating is that Trump actually still outperforms Nikki Haley with independents. He has, or independents in general, rather. And he has about 35% of independents to Haley's 26% in Iowa. So if you were to translate that over to New Hampshire, she obviously wouldn't be able to pick up enough independents to really make a difference in that state. Also fascinating from that Des Moines Register poll is that Trump performs really well among first-time caucus goers in Iowa, which tend to be a younger crowd. Those are typically people who are just now obtaining the right to vote because they've aged into it. So some pretty interesting, fascinating insights, I think, from that poll. Nikki Haley, of course, also got this multi-million-dollar influx of cash from Americans for Prosperity, which is a Koch-backed network. And a lot of people were very confused by this because she is very much an interventionist and Koch world is very much not. According to people I know who are familiar with AFP and know quite a few of the people on the foreign policy team there was basically an internal mutiny when they announced that they were going to endorse Nikki Haley and help her try to win the nomination. But the fact that she actually stayed at 16% in that Des Moines Register poll since October, despite this massive ad buy, despite the fact that AFP is mobilizing its massive grassroots effort and its grassroots organizing, kind of tells you everything you need to know. She's pretty much hit her ceiling in terms of her ability to be successful in the primary. DeSantis actually increased 3 points in Iowa. Trump went up by about 8. So you can see the trend lines going to their sort of inevitable conclusion right now.
This is a candidate without a constituency in the Republican Party of sizable number, but influential people hold the same wrong-headed national security and foreign policy views on the one hand, and then I think Will is right on the libertarian side, the worst of the libertarian or so-called libertarian impulses as well. And that does lead to the question of, so what is the point of getting behind the candidacy? And maybe to Will's point, this is establishment, quote unquote, willingness to lose with honor. And that is probably a feather in Ron DeSantis's camp to some extent, that you don't have, unlike in 2016 with Ted Cruz, you had coalescing behind Cruz at the end, people who hated his guts because there was no other vehicle to potentially topple Trump in that case. In this case, the fact that they are content to go down with the ship with Nikki Haley, and I guess many people will line their pockets as that ship goes down as well, is very telling about the state of the establishment. And it will be interesting to see if this election is more of another nail in the establishment coffin, or on the other hand, if it does reassert itself in a meaningful way.
I will take us to our final topic of the show, which is the fact that a satanic display was put up in the state capitol in Iowa under the leadership of Governor Kim Reynolds. And there's been sort of a internal fight among the right about the correct posture towards this kind of display. And you have this really aggressive libertarian bent that still exists in the modern conservative movement, where they sort of value this pie in the sky idea of liberty above all else. And that has caused them to really twist themselves into pretzels into thinking that it is by any means acceptable or required under the First Amendment to allow this satanic display in the state capitol. It's this it's taking value neutrality basically to its illogical conclusion, I would posit. And my immediate reaction to seeing this display was take them to court. We repeatedly hear this refrain, well, you can't do anything about it because if you try to sue them, you're just going to lose. And no one has ever really tried. There's not a lot of legal precedent to say that these displays would necessarily remain up. No one has really gone so far as to really pursue a real legal challenge. And there's a great article in the American Conservative from back in March from Frank DeVito, who is an attorney with the Napa Legal Foundation. And he points out that the whole libertarian requirement for allowing satanic displays is based on an opening up of the definition of what a religion is. These are routinely put up by the Satanic Temple, which for one doesn't even really believe that Satan exists. They view him as a symbol for rebellion and freedom. And fundamentally, it's a rejection of God and a rejection of religion. And yet somehow they've enjoyed religious protection under the First Amendment for decades. They've been trying to put after-school Satan clubs in schools. They've erected these displays around Christmas time to basically try to own the Christians. And it's so obviously in bad faith that the fact that no one has really tried beyond settling with them to take them to court is pretty bizarre. And really quite frustrating because I think if you have a society that has warped the concept of religion to the point that they are openly accepting blasphemy and allowing it to be displayed in state capitals, you don't really have a society worth preserving at that point. So I'd be curious to hear the group's thoughts on this. An originalist interpretation of the idea of religious freedom would be related to the definition of religion at the time, which was necessarily beliefs that were oriented towards God or some other divine power, which obviously Satanism would not qualify under that definition, and certainly not the Satanic Temple, which again doesn't even really believe that Satan exists. And also there's a long history in America of blasphemy not being permitted under the First Amendment in terms of free speech rights. So I say take them to court. I don't care how long it takes. I don't care how much money it takes. I think if this is the kind of thing that is being erected in state capitals, again, this by no means helps the common good. It doesn't support the growth of a values-oriented and good society. And while the Satanic Temple might think that they're just trolling and having a good time, these displays do have power. Satan derives power from them. So I'd be interested to hear how the group feels about this. And maybe there's someone here who does take a little bit more of a libertarian approach to it.
Well, there are two different definitions of religion in First Amendment law. And this is sort of a collision course that has been inevitable, I think, since the 1960s. And so on the one hand, the definition of religion for the purposes of establishment, of the Establishment Clause, right, is quite precise, and requires some of the elements that you're pointing to, Amber. So in other words, right, the secular humanism that abounds, or the ideology now that of wokeism, whatever you want to call it, that abounds, that in many ways you could describe as a religion. This is James Lindsay has this idea. I think it's a total failure legally to help try to define it as a religion, right? But for the purposes of the Establishment Clause, that doesn't count as a religion. It's not just a deeply held belief about, sort of the metaphysical existence of God and the universe, or some kind of order, right? It is tighter on the establishment side, and otherwise, we would have a case of throwing out some of these, like, sort of woke ideology on the matter of First Amendment Establishment Clause, right, from some of these institutions. Well, the definition on the Free Exercise Clause is much, much more elastic. And a lot of that comes from cases during the Vietnam War of conscientious objectors who were not members of, let's say, traditional religions like, the Quakers, who were pacifist or whatever else, but they were seeking exemptions to military service based on deeply held beliefs that are not in accordance with any organized religion. And courts recognized those rights as free exercise rights for the purpose of exempting them from the Vietnam draft. So what we have are these two different definitions that are incompatible, that essentially skew the field against the right and against traditional religious people, right? They can't advance their ideas in certain ways in relation to government because they're as clearly defined religions. There are certain ways in which in the American Constitution forbids them from doing that. At the same time, there are sort of domestic opponents, their ideas are not considered under the Establishment Clause, but are given the same kinds of free exercise protections from the other half of the First Amendment. So this is one of those things that I hope that this current Supreme Court might tackle and solve to I don't know exactly what the balance is in between those two definitions, but it's clear to me that it cannot continue having two different definitions of the same word of the same concept within the same amendment, in the First Amendment, right, between the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment. Just pulling out for a moment, there is this sense that the Constitution and our originalist interpretations of the Constitution, there were massive changes made in the 1960s in terms of jurisprudence. And there's a lot of identification, even on the center right, with that as the good liberalism, right? And by which I mean broader than the left liberalism, but like the kind of liberalism, classical liberalism that libertarians defend or whoever. A lot of those decisions, including about, for example, defamation law, about the ability of media outlets to write whatever they want about public figures without much consequence, right? A lot of those things came out of developments that would have, another big one in this case, obscenity, right? The basic collapsing of the obscenity exception to the First Amendment. All of those things come out of 60s and 70s jurisprudence, and they were massively transformational at the time. They stripped states of what was their traditional power to regulate health, safety, and morals on the state level. So that's largely been stripped out by that set of cases, which now, for some reason, even a lot of people on the right identify as our kind of constitutional liberalism that is inherent to the American system. It's not. It's a recent vintage, and as Amber says, a lot of it would have been very out of keeping with how the founders thought about, or how the original public meaning of the Constitution was originally conceived of.
I think I don't have as sophisticated a view of the law as Inez does. It's not like an area I've done a lot of work on, but I'll say this is just one of those cases where, as Amber puts it, you should litigate. And I say that as a person who isn't religious. Satanism is fake. It's not a real religion. And so I don't think freedom of religion was meant to contemplate something that really is just an anti-religion, and is just kind of a joke designed to mock every other religion. That's not what the point of freedom of religion is. And so I'd say to them, I mean, I think even Scalia said something about this, that it was just like a gut check moment where you say, is Satanism really a religion that needs protection? Is it what actually the First Amendment is protecting? And I think his answer would be no, or would have been no, rather. So, this is one of those cases where litigate it. You don't have to just stand idly by. Like, ultimately, if you go through litigation and a court orders you to let the thing stay up in the Capitol, then fine, right? Then the court can own that. But I wouldn't put up with this for a second. And I think it's a very virtuous and good use of Iowa taxpayer dollars to try and litigate the issue, if there's any possibility of prevailing in court.
I agree. And this points to the broader issue, which is that the notion of separation between church and state has been radically misinterpreted, and I think willfully misframed by those who are not only irreligious, but anti-religious. And it's used essentially the purported freedom of exercising one's religion here, an establishment of religion, barring state from establishing religion, is used as a cudgel to go after Jews and Christians while privileging anti-religious progressive forces. And that is ultimately, at the end of the day, why they wanted religion out of the classroom. In part, they wanted to replace it with the state's anti-religion of progressivism. So this is in keeping with that same sort of philosophy. Of course, the entire system, when you go back and you look at the founders, even those founders who themselves were not religious, believed that it was imperative that there was virtue inculcated by religion in the people. And of course, that our founding documents themselves come from Judeo-Christian founding values and principles as well. So it's a wild, radical notion that somehow Satanists should be given protection and space here. And I hope it is litigated to the fullest extent. And I hope that the non-Satanists prevail.
We'll go ahead and transition to final thoughts, and I'll go ahead first because I want to piggyback off of what Ben said there, which is there has been such a misinterpretation of the idea of separation of church and state and freedom of religion in our country that there are progressives and Democrats who legitimately believe that you are not even allowed to legislate based on your morals if they happen to come from a religious framework. I got into an argument with a former Biden official on one of my other shows, and he was insistent that Biden is correct to not be pro-life as a Catholic because he's simply trying to legislate on behalf of the American people, and he couldn't comprehend the idea that every single law comes from a moral framework. Every time we are legislating for morality, and there shouldn't be any more value given to someone's moral framework because it might come from an irreligious perspective versus a religious one. But so often we hear this refrain from the left that politicians need to keep their religion out of government. And it's a complete warping of what that section of the First Amendment was supposed to mean.
I'll take up just a couple positive items in the war for free speech. Maybe we'll talk about it in a future episode. But one is this lawsuit that's being put forth by Texas, the Daily Wire, and the Federalist, which is taking on the feds, particularly the State Department, over the funding of the likes of NewsGuard and the Global Disinformation Index. These are essentially conservative speech assassins doing business as neutral arbiters of what constitutes facts and rooting out dis, and malinformation on the internet. They're used to create blacklists of largely conservative sources, which advertisers then use not to advertise on conservative websites and to essentially defund conservative news and opinion by proxy. And of course, GDI and NewsGuard have been lavish, have had federal funds lavished on them to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the Federalist, Daily Wire, Texas are targeting those efforts, funding particularly from the State Department's GEC, Global Engagement Center, which was supposed to be about countering foreign disinformation information, but of course has bled into the domestic realm. And then also less noticed, and I have to do some more digging on it, and again, we'll maybe explore it in another episode, is that Missouri, which of course is leading the Missouri v. Biden case, has also put Media Matters on notice that it is investigating Media Matters for, and I'll just quote directly here from the press release, potentially using fraud to solicit donations from Missourians in order to trick advertisers into pulling out of X, the last platform dedicated to free speech in America. Radicals are attempting to kill Twitter because they cannot control it, and we are not going to let Missourians get ripped off in the process. So Media Matters now facing legal scrutiny and potentially peril from Elon Musk as well as the state of Missouri. A couple good developments for free speech in America.
Yeah, my final thought is a continuation of my topic on universities. Just to make a couple more points against being so black-pilled, you missed this major opportunity, I think. So one, just to rattle off the things that could be done, many of them could be done under the regulatory state. And so if we had a Republican president in 2024, these are like things, a lot of these things are on the table. Some of them are legislative, some of them might be able to be done at the state level, but we could draw down student loan funding, which would collapse a large part of the university sector in America. If we just drew down student loan funding, it's all government backed. We could also pull Title IV grants, which universities rely on to complete their research. Or on either one of those things, we could put riders that require universities to do all kinds of things, including getting rid of their DEI institutions, whatever, sort of reforms we think are necessary in the university. We can attach riders to that money. The universities rely on that money. They cannot operate without that money. We could change their tax status. They are currently, they're currently nonprofits. We could carve them out and say, no, you're responsible, for example, for the large bill of student debt that you've run up, that your institutions have run up over the course of the last 20 years. We could directly tax their endowments as well as their properties on the state level. They are huge landowners. The University of California is the largest landlord in California. We could open up either regulatorily or directly in public discourse a conversation about Griggs, the Supreme Court case that made it illegal in the United States to test employees because some on the group level there are racial disparate impacts. As I said in my point, my original university segment, everything has a disparate impact. There's nothing special about these kinds of tests. We could make a push to reinstitute the kind of screening and tests that employers formally use instead of a $100,000 degree that's going to put an 18-year-old into debt for the rest of his life, potentially. And we could attack that sort of CRA/DEI, especially post-90s CRA legal structure. All of those things are a matter of political will. They can be done, and they would seriously injure universities. And I think there is public opinion coalescing around the need to take seriously the fact that these universities are declaring themselves to be enemies of America in so many different ways. And one final thought on resentment. I understand, and I even can sort of sympathize with certain sort of resentments from the right about the fact that this is what tipped the scale on universities. They've obviously been they've been good leftist institutions, including being discriminating against white males, Asian males, right? This is not the only sort of hatred that has been rampant on university campuses. Jew hatred is not the only hatred that universities tolerate and encourage, right? And it has not been for decades now. I think it would be a massive mistake for the right to go with that resentment and let it sort of pass them by, this massive opportunity to hit one of our major enemies where it hurts. I think this could be the kind of moment, I'm not sure yet, but it could be the kind of moment, just like in June of 2020 and then the upcoming school year in 2020, where parents finally realized, even though they knew, things had changed a little bit since when they were in school, where we had this mass movement of parents across the country that realized, holy crap, this is what they're teaching my 10-year-old, because they heard it coming from their kitchen tables. If there was a similar kind of, for lack of a better word, normie understanding of just how radical the university system is, which even though everyone knows that they're liberal, I think there still was a lot of sort of head in the sand behavior from a lot of people in America with regard to how deep the rot went in universities and in the higher ed sector. It could be a tipping point in the same way that the last few years have been a tipping point for school choice, where people were finally like, oh, hell no, I'm not sending my kid to this, right? Hell no, I'm not going to donate to my alma mater. Hell no, I'm pulling my donations. Like, I'm going to explore sending my kids to Hillsdale, right? I think this could be a massive tipping point. There are so many, unlike many issues, like there is a clear policy agenda where we could very seriously damage the power, prestige, and wealth of universities. That would be a huge W for the right. I think it would be a tragedy if we missed it.
Yeah, my final thought is something that just popped up on X. I saw that in Ukraine, we're looking at a situation where Zelensky is trying to get more funding from the United States government right now, and is saying that he's thinking about conscripting people over the age of 40 to join the military. That's not a good sign. This is you don't want to be conscripting the elderly to fight your wars. If you are, it's a sign that you're losing and losing badly. It's not clear what the Biden administration's plan is here. I think sometimes you lose wars, and it's pretty clear that this one is lost. I hope that people have the who are in charge have the good sense to say to the Ukrainian administration, we're not giving you any more money, and you need to go sue for peace. That seems like the straightforward answer here. But yeah, very sad news, but still very concerning, especially. And it looks like at least the one bright spot is that Mike Johnson isn't going to agree to give them that money unless they're willing to secure the border, which they probably aren't willing to do in any event. So
wonderful. We're going to leave it there. Thanks for joining us this week. On behalf of Inez, Ben, and Will, I'm Amber Duke, and we will see you next time on NatCon Squad.